Welcome. We're very lucky today to have Robert V. Young Jr., Professor Emeritus, Renaissance Literature and Literary Criticism from the English Department of North Carolina State University, co-founder and co-editor with Thomas Hester of the John Donne Journal, author of many books and articles on the study of literature. He was also the editor of the quarterly Modern Age from 2007. And he's written articles in many journals and periodicals, including the John Donne Journal, the Ben Jonson Journal. And I have to say, I was in Volpone in high school too. First Things, Hadley Arks used to work down the hall from me at the Heritage Foundation. The Weekly Standard, Bill Crystal used to help when David Horowitz and I were trying to cut NEA funding. The National Review, Buckley invited me to dinner at his house after not putting me on firing line during the PBS stuff, and Culture Wars, a journal I don't know, but I was involved in what they called that in the 90s in Washington. Also, former president of the John Donne Society, received the 2002 award for distinguished publication in Donne Studies for his book, Doctrine and Devotion in 17th Century Poetry, senior editor of Touchstone magazine, and has published essays on a wide variety of topics in Renaissance, medieval, and 20th century literary theory and criticism. And you have a special interest in poets John Donne, Richard Crashaw, Henry Vaughan, and George Herbert. Dr. Young received his BA in English from Rollins College, right here in Florida. And my mother-in-law used to live in Winter Park, and we used to go to that beautiful campus many times. And his master's degree and PhD from Yale University. And he's a fluent reader and translator of Latin, as well as a convert to the Roman Catholic faith. So we can talk about that as well if he wants, and how it relates to literature. I was struck by one thing I was reading from, of course, the Wikipedia summary, a very interesting article, Nature and Grace in the Character of Western Man, from Christianity and Western Civilization, Christopher Dawson's insight, Can Culture Survive the Loss of Its Religious Roots? And I think that may be something we want to get into. And then one other striking title, The Gay Invention, which I don't think is about John Gay or people being glittering and be gay like Cunegonde, but we'll have to see if that is an issue that you want to delve into or stay away from in our discussion. And with that, I want to draw attention, as you can see in the background, these are two books written many years apart, I guess 20 years apart, by Professor Young. The first is At War with the Word, Literary Theory and Liberal Education, which was sort of a response to deconstruction and the early sort of attacks on the canon and basically literature itself. And then the other is Shakespeare and the Idea of Western Civilization, which makes the case that Shakespeare sort of embodies Western civilization. And if you want to talk about the canon, should not be thrown out into the trash, as some people are suggesting, because he's a dead white male. So with that introduction, I want to say I'm very grateful. And I should say, I met Professor Young just by chance at a luncheon of the Pinellas Opera League. So I know he's an opera fan, and as well. And if you want to talk about opera in this context, many of Shakespeare's plays were, of course, adapted for operas, including Othello and Macbeth. Please feel free. So let's start talking with about Shakespeare and the idea of Western civilization. What caused you to write this book?
Well, I should point out that the book was written over many, many years. I was not considered a Shakespeare expert in my department because I didn't do my dissertation on Shakespeare, wasn't, sort of in that particular club. My The upper level courses I taught were 17th century non-dramatic literature, 16th century non-dramatic, and then the history of literary criticism. Uh, they never would let me teach the literary theory course in our graduate program because I hadn't, again, done my dissertation in that. But to the best of my knowledge, I'm the only one who actually published a book on literary theory in the department. So we'll just let that sit there as it is. Why did I write this book? I taught Shakespeare at the undergraduate level frequently, for a long time at North Carolina State, which for the first 20 or so years that I was there would be considered a rather conservative department on the whole. I mean, we had fairly strict curriculum for English majors. They pretty much had to cover the canon. We had survey courses and specialized courses at a higher level. And I taught a lot of undergraduate Shakespeare, both the one for English majors and a little introductory course for people who were fulfilling their literature requirement by doing it. And honestly, the last one was the one I enjoyed the most because a lot of them came in and, what's this stuff? But a lot of them were just enthralled. They'd never read it before and were very excited. So that was a lot of fun. And these students are hearing a lot of what I thought were crazy things about Shakespeare. And about this time, we're talking now 90s, mid 90s, I was getting well enough known to get invited to speak at a lot of other colleges and other organizations and whatnot. And I got an interest in Shakespeare and started giving talks about him. And I talked about different plays. I gave a Romeo and Juliet talk. I gave a talk on Hamlet. I gave a talk on this, that, and the other. But after about 10 or 15 years of this, I discovered that they all focused on showing how Shakespeare, in effect, represented reality, which is what literature and drama do. They give us a mimesis or a representation of the world we live in. I think the best way to put it is they represent human experience. They're not scientific studies or anything like that. They give us a way of looking more intensely at our experience, specifically as human beings. After I'd done about 6 or 7 of these talks, I realized I've got a book here. Well, I had a couple of other things in train then. I was editing the John Donne Journal. I was working on a bilingual edition of a work by the Flemish humanist Justus Lipsius that I was translating into Latin or into English from Latin, and that's really hard work, and it takes a lot of time. So it was a long time before I finally got the Shakespeare book written. But basically, I put together a series of talks that I'd given in various places: Hillsdale College, University of Delaware, Swanee down in Tennessee, up in Tennessee from where we are now. I gave a Shakespeare talk at Seattle Pacific University, just all over the place, really. I gave one at an ISI conference at Oxford, in at one of the colleges there. So but I like to think that I put them together in a coherent fashion. And what I was basically trying to do was provide an interpretation of Shakespeare that showed that he was who he was. Shakespeare is Shakespeare because he succeeds in embodying what I would call the distinctive insights, values, ways of looking at the world that I think we can associate specifically with Western civilization. And in the book, what I say that is a balancing of the creation of a tradition that goes on combined with a critical spirit that is constantly reforming it and looking closely at it and making us rethink what we've done. So, I mean, in a sense, Shakespeare to me is a good example of what for Edmund Burke was conservatism. You preserve your traditions, but as Burke says, nothing can last if it doesn't change. You're constantly subjecting them to further critique and consideration and trying to improve without turning the world upside down in one generation. So I wrote the book to give a counterweight to what I saw as what was becoming a predominant tendency among most contemporary scholars of Shakespeare, either A, to reject him out of hand as I think you may have mentioned, as a kind of dead white male who has nothing to say to a progressive political order, or B, trying to co-opt him as a sort of propagandist for it. And I tried to give a view of Shakespeare which didn't answer all the questions. I don't think for a moment that I've said everything you can say about Shakespeare. Certainly, there are things people are going to come along and say, well, have you considered this? And the answer is, well, probably I didn't. Let me hear about that. But that's why I wrote the book.
I found I haven't read the whole thing, but I did have a chance to skim it and read. I did read your introduction and your conclusion and bits in the middle. I was struck, to my eye, by the amount of religious discussion you have. In other words, the leftists always say all art is political, but you point out there's a great deal of religious symbolism and religious themes, and indeed religious storylines. And in fact, it looks like theological debate over such things as the existence of purgatory. Do you want to discuss that a little bit?
Okay, just sort of in what nowadays is called full disclosure or being transparent. You mentioned I'm a Catholic. I take my faith very seriously. I'm also, I mean, I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine, the subtitle of which is a magazine of mere Christianity, a phrase borrowed from C.S. Lewis, who in turn borrowed it from Richard Baxter back in the 17th century. And it suggests, and I should mention that book, Doctrine and Devotion, one of the points I argue is that although this was the era of a very ferocious battle between Reformation Protestants and Counter-Reformation Catholics, nevertheless, they kept more in common than they differed over. And what I tried to show was that there was a core of fundamental Christianity that they retained. The reason I talk about Christian themes in the book about Shakespeare is because Shakespeare talks about them because they were the common currency of his civilization. I mean, everybody went to church. Probably some of them weren't terribly enthusiastic, but everybody knew it. If they'd read one of the things the Reformation did, and probably there wouldn't have been a Reformation without the printing press, was they got everybody reading the Bible, which is both a good thing and a problematic thing. It's great to have people read the Bible. When they go off and sort of make it up as they go along, that's maybe not so great. So the religious themes are just there. They were part and parcel of the society, and the political order was shaped by it. Those who, I mean, I say Western civilization, I could just as easily say the civilization of Christendom, by which I mean the civilization that evolved out of the conversion of Europe through the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries and so on. Its amalgamation of both Greco-Roman classical ideas and Hebrew ideas. I mean, Christianity is unthinkable without Judaism. Christianity sees itself as the fulfillment of the Jewish prophets. So there's a lot of different things coming in together here. Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. More laterally, I suppose, Heidelberg and places like that, Geneva as well. They're jostling, bumping into each other, but there is a sort of consistent civilization. What is starting to happen about the time Shakespeare is writing, which is what makes him, other writers like Donne and Milton, so interesting, is that we're at the threshold of the beginning of the rebellion against that civilization. And I think most of the people who started it, in their minds, they were first purging Christianity, and then by the time you get to the 18th century Enlightenment, especially the French Enlightenment, they're getting rid of Christianity altogether. It's seen as superstitious and backward and whatnot. But they're criticizing it and attacking it with ideas that existed nowhere else except in Christian civilization. That's people have pointed out that in some ways Marxism is a kind of Christian heresy that gets rid of God and tries to retain some of the ideas. If you were looking closely, I'm going to make you very angry with me now and refer quickly to At War with the Word. I make the point that Derrida is at his best in pointing out that the radical French Enlightenment, all its ideas of rationalism, are smuggling God in through the back door. If you've, and Nietzsche, of course, said this before Derrida, if you've got the idea of a stable reason, you've got God, whether you like it or not. After all, the second person of the Trinity is the Logos. Jesus of Nazareth is the Logos incarnate, and that means reason, discourse, order. We get our words logic and all those logy words, biology, theology, everything that has to do, it's the study of or discourse about something. So Derrida wants to get rid not merely of God, but of logic and reason, which he says don't really work. So that's what's going. I mean, that's why it's religious, is because most of the ideas in our civilization, at least, are founded on. I'm being redundant now. They have a religious foundation. I was about to say they were founded on a foundation, but this is why it's hard to talk off the cuff.
Well, that's okay. I think it's true they're founded on a foundation. As long as we're talking about it, War with the Word, it was written in the 1990s, and you mentioned Derrida. One of the characters in it is Paul de Man, who was, I don't know if he was the founder or the leader, but still a big proponent of deconstruction, which really was based at Yale University. You told me earlier you left right before he came, but could you talk a little bit about his influence and why you think it spread so far and became so influential when, to an outsider, it seems like just nonsense?
Okay. Deconstruction didn't begin at Yale. It kind of took it over with the so-called Gang of Four. When I was there, Jeffrey Hartman was already there. But Derrida, de Man, J. Hillis Miller, oh, and Bloom was already there. But the Gang of Four was Derrida, de Man, J. Hillis Miller, and Harold Bloom. And Bloom always denied being a deconstructionist. And I talk about him, of course, in the book. And he calls himself a, how does he put it? A Gnostic is his way of, and there's some, I mean, he's probably right about that. But what they all have in common, of course, is wanting to get rid of all the limits. Nietzsche somewhere says, and I couldn't find it. I tried to find it and I couldn't turn it up. He says, as long as we've got grammar, we're not free. And grammar, of course, is the imposition of order on discourse, on speech. And there's a kind of anarchy that is part of all of this stuff. De Man, I mean, really what de Man appeals to is people's wanting to be free in the absolute sense. I mean, think of the Romantic movement, which makes Satan the hero of Paradise Lost. Satan is defiant against God. Now, Milton didn't really intend that. It seems to me, Milton, I should mention I'm right now in the process of editing a critical edition of Paradise Lost for the Ignatius Press. It's for students, and that's my current principal project I'm working on. So I'm thinking about Milton. Milton, I think, does a brilliant job of showing why Satan is an attractive character, which he has to do. People say, oh my God, Milton really made the devil the best character in the thing. He did a brilliant job of showing why we still fall under the spell of Satan, because he appeals to what in us, according to Christianity, is sin. But even if you're not Christian and you don't want to accept the doctrine of original sin, which I agree with Chesterton, by the way, in saying that's the one Christian doctrine anybody with any sense will accept. All you have to do is a little introspection. You see yourself saying what St. Paul said: the good I ought to do, I don't do, and the bad I don't want to do, I do anyway. And Satan appeals to the rebelliousness in us. So did Paul de Man. De Man, Derrida, Bloom, J. Hillis Miller, I could throw in Jeffrey Hartman. They all, in a sense, harking back to Nietzsche, want to overturn, Plato, among other things, the whole idea of reason, of our guiding and controlling our passions, our longings, our desires by a rational order which makes it possible for us to live together. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, well, as long as we're talking about deconstruction, this was, I guess it started in the 70s. I don't really know exactly when it started, but by the 90s, it had become pretty dominant. I know when I was in graduate school, uh, they were teaching about phallologocentrism as sort of an evil male sin that had to be eliminated from all study of literature, and I have a degree in film and television, and it was so bad. You had all the required courses. You had to take this, and it's the only time I had to have a drink to write a term paper, just because I should have dropped out, but I just wanted to get my degree. So I mean, I saw how people live under oppressive societies, and that was sort of one of the things that got me onto the other side. But the fact that it made no sense, that it's impossible, that it's just basically being thought police and name calling, and it's totally negative and destructive in its effects, and I believe in its intentions, didn't seem to make a bit of difference. I mean, if you look at enrollment in literature departments over the years since it was introduced, it's collapsed because people used to enjoy, as you said, your Shakespeare for non-majors or whatever. People would enjoy it, but they took all the fun out, and it was like, you know, the Puritan who can't sleep because somebody's dancing somewhere. Um, and you know, speaking of Milton, the next thing they've gone after, of course, is the same type of legacy, is free speech, and the Areopagitica, you know, which was a foundational document, is not even discussed. And so, you know, there is some connection between religion, politics, literature, and society that's very important. And you know, in your book, you're writing about literary theory and liberal education, what liberal education is supposed to do. And it seems very different from a lot of the so-called conservatives who I ran into who said, what are you going to do with a degree in women's studies? Or what are you going to do with a degree in literature? Learn to code or study engineering or chemistry. So why don't we take a step back and go to a basic premise? What is the value of a liberal education for a person?
Just a footnote first. When I retired from the English department at North Carolina State in 2012, we had somewhere around 55, 56, almost 60 tenure track faculty members. A couple of years ago, my last friend retired from the department, and he said we were down to just over 30 tenure track members. Attrition, they weren't hiring people. There were no majors. They had utterly destroyed the major. Now, back to what you said. Um, the purpose, I get very, very vexed with so-called conservatives who want to know how much money you're going to make and everybody should take STEM subjects. A lot of people should take STEM subjects. They're interesting, but an undergraduate education is not supposed to have, come with a guaranteed job. It's not vocational training. It ought to make you the kind of person who people would want to hire because you're thoughtful, well read, can express yourself, and are able to fit into a lot of different contexts, be a good citizen, a useful member of society, uh, interesting conversationalist at leisure. It's to make you into really a better kind of person. And the liberal part about that is precisely that you have a free mind. I think what's happened to modern contemporary political liberalism is that it has confused a personal virtue, liberality, with a political program. And you can't make people, liberality is sort of the, what would we call it? The British bourgeois version of Aristotelian magnanimity. Maybe you don't have a great soul, but you've got a generous spirit at least. And that's really what I think we try to do is cultivate a generosity, a liberality, a freedom of mind and spirit. But if you are a ferocious ideologue, you don't have that. You can't abide listening to anyone else say anything. So you should take all kinds of courses, but they should have some sort of coherence. Think of the word curriculum. It's a course, it's a running, it's going in a direction, it's making you conversant at least with mathematics, developments in science, history, geography. Think of the way that, try to find a student who can find anything on the map. It's they can't. I mean, remember when they were all saying, "From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free." Somebody went out and interviewed a bunch of students who were chanting this. None of them could identify either the river or the sea. Some of them said the Nile. I'm surprised that they'd have said the Euphrates, but they'd probably never heard of it. I wouldn't be surprised if the Mississippi came up, but they really had no idea what they were talking about. And literature, philosophy, history, they're part of this, and they should fit together. And you specialize in one with a major. I mean, the idea of a major is a fairly recent idea. Liberal education for Middle Ages through the Renaissance into the 18th century, which you all studied pretty much the same thing. You mostly studied it in Latin and Greek, and which had the double advantage of teaching you a language, languages which are difficult and made you think and help develop your mind in a way analogous to mathematics. And also you learned a whole lot about the world by reading the great authors that you read to learn those languages. There's nothing wrong. I mean, at this point, we really need to do it in our own vernacular, but we do need to learn to read across different disciplines and, above all else, unify them, see how they fit in with our nature as human beings. So I would call our nature and condition as men and women on this planet and in society.
So what you're saying is reading great literature. You have a quote in the conclusion of your book, which I'll read. I read it earlier. What the Greek and Latin writers have left us, Cicero explains, are distinct models of gallant men, not only for contemplation, but even for imitation. The key phrase here is distinct models. Imaginis expressus. That is, models or figures or images finely crafted or shaped or squeezed out. If they are also for imitation, they are initially for contemplation. And indeed, that is how they are imitated, by assimilation into our souls, into our rational and imaginative being through study and contemplation. So basically, you're saying that a true liberal arts education is a character education. It's a character building enterprise. And the point of everything we read and study is to make us better citizens, basically, able to live in a free society, think for ourselves, make decisions, and evaluate what's going on. This is a very different project from a deconstructionist project, or indeed a openly Marxist ideological project, or even a trade school. How did the university, and I think you went to the best English department in the country, so how did the best English department in the country at the best, school become its opposite? How did it become a deconstruction factory, deconstructing the field almost in its entirety, to where, indeed, you said a funny thing there about grammar, because now very often, they no longer teach handwriting in elementary school. And already when I was in elementary school, they had stopped teaching grammar, and we had SRA reading booklets in different colors, orange, blue, whatever, where we just had short phrases put together. And they said we wouldn't have to learn grammar. We'd pick it up the other way, which I actually found a reference somewhere to one New York City school in 1948. They had dropped grammar. So progressive education actually was opposed to learning grammar. But as you said, grammar is how you think. I only learned grammar by taking foreign languages, especially Russian grammar, which has got more cases. But I never got very good at it and my wife studied Greek and Latin. She's very good at grammar. So grammar, the grammar school was abolished. And next comes higher education. And indeed, you're going to have illiterates who can't write. And eventually, they say most college students today don't even read a book. They can't read. They don't have the patience due to high tech. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned about grammar schools. When I was in school, I started school in the 50s. It was still grammar school. And I was taught phonics and how to read with that. It was probably the thing that saved me. I got very little good foreign language education. I was taught well in Spanish. The other languages I know I had to teach myself, which I think was a real inhibitor for what I did, but I labored through it. How did this? I want to go back to your question about Yale. In a sense, I was on the threshold of seeing that happen. And the professors that I was closest to, William K. Wimsatt Jr., for instance, I took a 2-semester course from him, one of the most intelligent, learned men I've ever known. And I worked for him. He hired me to sort of just help him around his office. I proofread a book he was publishing and caught some things in it that the printer had messed up. I went to the library and he had to put together an anthology of things, and he'd read them all, but it had been a long time. I read through all of them, made digest of them, and probably learned more doing that about literary criticism and theory in any course I took, because I had to read them and assimilate them and give a précis of them to this man whom I was terrified of, not because there was anything wrong, but just because I was in awe of him. He was very concerned about what was happening. And he could see in a couple of others the conservatives and the old-fashioned liberals, and most of them were old-fashioned liberals at Yale, had open minds. They wanted to hire people with different views. So, golly, we ought to hire some. They hired, for instance, Harold Bloom and Jeffrey Hart, who were both pretty radical in their way of looking at things. But hey, they're smart men, they're interesting, and they were bright men. I won't deny that for a moment. But once a critical mass of people of that viewpoint came in, they just cut everybody else out. Because if you see literature not as something that you are kind of going to try to understand and interpret and present to other people because it's inherently valuable. I don't know if you remember the passage I quote from Franklin Tricia, where he says, literature is inherently nothing or a repertoire of rhetorical strategies waiting to be seized. If literature is just something you use to push your own political point of view, then you're not going to let anybody in who doesn't see things exactly the way you do, or at least pretty close to it. So that's what happened. The people who were running the English department at Yale, and for aught I know, I saw it happen at the North Carolina State Department too. We hired some people because of their sex or their skin color over people who were certainly more qualified candidates to fill up a quota. They never used that language, but that's what it was. And if you've got an ideological project going, the whole idea of liberal education simply evaporates. It's just not there at all. You're looking for people who will be comrades in arms, not for people who will challenge you and give you somebody to have interesting arguments with, which is to me the whole point of, that's the whole great thing of being a college professor is having colleagues who are like-minded in some ways, but who are going to argue with you and challenge you and make you do what you're doing better. That's what you want from your students too.
Well, they say young people today don't know how to have a discussion or an argument. They're very uncomfortable with conflict. They can't take new information that may not fit with old information, and they become very rigid and dogmatic. And it's sort of interesting now that you've mentioned this, also because you said you became a Catholic convert. One of the raps Catholicism has is dogma versus Protestantism, which is open and has lots of sects and different views. But the Catholic Church is far less dogmatic, I think, than any of these English departments where we see what's going on.
Dogma in the Catholic Church basically just means a teaching. And there are fundamental teachings in Christianity. Most of the Protestants who are my friends have plenty of dogmas. But dogma, I mean, the point about it is, if it's a dogma, we say, this is a dogma. And I'm pleased to say that I mean, people sometimes accuse me of being an enemy of Vatican II. I'm not. I think it did a lot of very good things. And one of the things it did was it reminded us that Christianity, like anything that's deeply important to you, has to be accepted willingly. Someone who's forced to be a Christian, or anything else for that matter, isn't going to be very good at it. And indeed, Christianity, you're not a good Christian if you just say, okay, I believe all that and I'll do everything you tell me. The first thing about being a Christian is loving Jesus. And the dogmas and the moral rules are there simply to help you do that. And because we have, if we're honest with ourselves, we have tendencies that lead us to be selfish, to be greedy, to want to have our own way about everything. And so when you're being terribly tempted by something, it's nice to have a hard and fast rule there telling you not to do that. If you're a married man, you've sworn to be married to this person and love her and cherish her and take care of her and be faithful to her. And suddenly you see this really attractive young woman and you're tempted. I mean, people are. Everybody is, I think, pretty much about something, one way or another. It's nice to know this is wrong. It's always wrong. This passion is going to pass. I will tell you something that people ought to be very alarmed about. Have you noticed that one of the most honorific terms in modern discourse is passion? We're all supposed to follow our passions. Well, I think the meaning has kind of changed, though it's still there. But in the ancient world, even before Christians came along, passions were to be subdued to reason.
But you
And
do have the passion of Christ, right?
well, the passion of Christ is passion literally means suffering. Passion means being possessed by something. Passion is cognate with being subjected to something. It's cognate with pathos, pathology, pathetic. Also, patience, suffering quietly, being humble. Christ's passion shows us how we should behave towards others. You can also become the things that are imposed on us from without. The danger is when we are slaves of our own desires, our own inclinations, and they're out of control. So there are two different ways of passion. Now, a lot of times people just mean, I really love this particular activity, idea, piece of music, or whatnot. And that's fairly innocent. But they talk about this all the time. I'm worried graduation speakers. I just went to my grandson's graduation from high school.
Oh,
One of my
okay.
grandsons, one of my many grandsons. And this follow your passion. Well, what do you mean by that? Because if you don't qualify that and point out that you should do this reasonably and thinking about it, I mean, which again is what education's about. It's teaching you how to use your reason, use good habits to channel your passions, your emotions, your desires in a way that is edifying for you and makes it possible for you to live peacefully with other people. So that's, I think, I don't know, how did I get on that?
I don't know, but you have a passion for literature. I can tell. We can get
Yes, I
it back
do.
to the
There's a paradox here, but literature is paradoxical.
back to the books you wrote. One of the things I think with these exemplars is whether in Shakespeare specifically or in literature generally, you do tend to see great literature as also a series of morality plays. I mean, your analysis of Shakespeare's plays, for instance, I was struck because when I was teaching, I had to teach Romeo and Juliet, and my students almost all these days would come and they would write papers. Oh, well, if Romeo and Juliet had just listened to their parents, everything would have been all right. And there's some of that in your analysis in terms of the established order, which I was surprised to see because when I was growing up, speaking of passion, the idea was, and I think Shakespeare says it in his, preamble, that their passion, their sacrifice, made this stupid, pointless Hatfield-McCoy feud end and brought peace to everybody. So anyway, it's a morality tale which people may get different morals from. Likewise, what was interesting in King Lear, you said, Goneril had a point. That entourage around King Lear, those knights were getting drunk and disorderly, and you wouldn't want them in your castle. So, I mean, what's interesting to me is you can actually interpret these, and we were always said, oh, what a cruel, heartless daughter she was to kick out her father and his friends. So we can see both sides. And I think that's one of the things you're saying with a liberal and an open mind. You can make both sides of an argument, but you have to say there's some moral theme going on in the plays. I mean, that it's not just mere words. In fact, when Hamlet says the conscience of the king is going to be caught by the little play he's going to put on, that's sort of what Shakespeare is doing with his other plays. So he's got it right there. And yet these people would ignore everything that's written and implied and simply assert counterfactuals as dogma, which now you have to repeat, or you can't get through the programs, get your degrees or whatever. And they have very little interest in the actual works themselves, which I think is why you find a lack of interest, because they're there to illustrate some sort of political point. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Okay, I want to go. Let's go first back to Romeo and Juliet. I think it's fascinating. When I was growing up, Romeo and Juliet were the heroine and heroine of true love, and everybody else was awful. And now you're telling me I hadn't run into any students who said that, because I retired.
I was surprised.
10 years ago or more, closer to 15, really. But the point I was trying to make is, I mean, the play's a tragedy. And tragedy is about good people, people with virtues, who do something wrong, who take a chance, who follow an impulse, and it ends in disaster. Romeo and Juliet are, I mean, they're adolescents, they're teenagers. They have powerful passions. They're in love, sure. There's a beauty in love. Poor Friar Lawrence is trying to say, wait, slow down. You don't, this will work out if you'll just be patient. You need to. And the parents are behaving terribly. Don't argue with that at all. But the point is, it's not a simple black and white kind of thing. I don't think you have to say, oh, Romeo and Juliet are perfect. If they just let them do what they wanted, everything would have been fine. Or, as these students you mentioned, oh, well, if Romeo and Juliet had just, obeyed their parents and taken, majored in STEM and learned how to code, everything would have been fine. No, you've got a lot of different people doing a lot of bad things. You've got Friar Lawrence trying to intervene in a way that helps everybody, and he falls on his face. He ends up trying to manipulate things he can't manipulate with the best possible intentions. Romeo, it would have been great if they'd let Romeo and Juliet marry, but they weren't listening to any of that. I don't know if you picked up, I know you were sort of reading this book at the last minute, but one of the points I make there, that Romeo and Juliet comes at a time when a huge discussion going on in European society, especially English society, is the sort of competition, let's call it, or the clash between friendship on the one hand and sexual love on the other. And there are books, a lot of books written around. I quote some of them in the in that chapter. And it's an interesting question about, on the one hand, we get carried away by our passions. You have to ask yourself, supposing Romeo and Juliet had married. Let's go 10 years ahead. Juliet's put on a little extra pounds. Romeo goes from one job to another. Oh my God, how's this going to work out? I can kind of see the Montagues saying, I give it 6 months at the wedding, after they've acceded to this. Um, on the other hand, there's Romeo's friendship with Mercutio, and Mercutio gets himself killed trying to intervene, and then you've got him, he gets involved in the feud too. So uh, these are all people who have let their passions run away with them. The passion of hatred among the parents, the passion of love/lust with Romeo and Juliet. I mean, they're just on fire with it. They use that particular metaphor. Friar Lawrence says you're like a powder keg with a match being struck to it, and it ends up with a disaster. So, in a sense, and I should mention, you should realize one of the interesting things I made students do, not in the generally in the lower level courses, but in the English major Shakespeare courses, one of the papers I have them write was to go look at Shakespeare's source and see what he did with it. His principal source in Romeo and Juliet was a long poem by Arthur Brooke, who couldn't go 6 lines without talking about the horrible lust of Romeo and Juliet and how it got them justly punished. I mean, that was your crude morality play. The archetypal morality play, Everyman, is a brilliant piece of dramatic literature. And it shows the tension between our passions and our reason, between our desires and our necessity to curb them and be humble. And that's so. And let's go back to King Lear. Goneril's a horrible daughter. She does terrible things, but that doesn't mean she doesn't have a point with Lear, who isn't behaving very well. Think of that opening scene where he's making a complete jackass of himself. This competition in who loves me most. I used to introduce that to my students by saying, have you ever been to a family reunion? And they all look at me, I'd say, you know that aunt or uncle who comes in and takes over and makes everybody do what he or she wants and dominates the whole thing and won't let anybody else get a word in edgewise and is telling everybody else what to do? And they all say, oh, yeah, that's Lear, that opening scene. He's become crotchety and tyrannical in his old age. I make the point that he's obviously been a much better man than that. He wouldn't have the friendship, he wouldn't have the love of his youngest daughter or the friendship of his better courtiers if he hadn't been. They're astounded at how badly he's behaving, but he does behave badly. Or look at Gloucester, preening himself on having seduced this woman and talking about his whoreson in front of the young man who's, this of course is Edmund, who's one of the most vicious characters in Shakespeare. And yet Gloucester has some role in that. He treats him well in his own way, looks after him, but he can't stop talking about what a gay young fellow he was, how he ran off with things, and how he seduced the women, and what a man about town he was, and this was the result of it. Not a bad kid. I'll look after him, even though he's a bastard. What's that doing to that boy? And yet Gloucester turns out to be a man of courage and loyalty with Lear. People aren't simple. When Cicero talks about models for our imitation, he doesn't mean in the sense, oh, pick out this guy and act just like him. Don't act like Hamlet. Don't act like Lear. Learn from them. This, you get kind of almost a laboratory experiment in human conduct in a drama. And then you take what you've learned in this sort of literary laboratory and you think about it when you're acting. Am I acting like Othello being jealous now? Am I acting like Lear, pushing other people around and being kind of a tiresome bully? Am I twiddling my thumbs like Hamlet, not being able to make up my mind whether I'm going out for revenge or I'm going to be cool about it? These are men who make, that's why they're tragedies. They make terrible errors, but they're not bad men. I make the point, you take the 4 great tragedies. In the first 3 of them, Hamlet, Othello, and Lear, Hamlet, Othello, and Edgar, the good son of Gloucester, all 3 of them are mentioned by their antagonists, Claudius, Iago, and Edmund, as being sincere, upright people who won't suspect. They'll be easy to trick because they're so honest and frank themselves. They're good men. They're not perfect. Othello commits a terrible murder. Hamlet leaves the stage littered with bodies. And yet we think he's essentially a good man. But good men do bad things sometimes. That's why there's tragedy in life.
Well, I think that's a good summation of why we should keep reading Shakespeare, because they go through these tragedies so we don't have to. Hopefully we learn from that. Let me ask about At War with the Word. Um, you don't just criticize deconstruction, you also criticized other trends, including the new historicism, particularly Stephen Greenblatt. And I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about all these trends in literary theory. How did they come to such a head that they basically sort of wiped out, you know, the simple appreciation of literature?
Well, I think lying behind it, especially with the new historicism and its English cousin, cultural materialism, the second one gives it away, the second term, materialism. If one of the things professors of literature, and in fact, almost every professor in the humanities, we all envy the sciences because, nobody says follow the humanities with a capital H, it's follow the science. And if you go on the internet, you've got science telling you where happiness comes from, the 5 signs of someone who's a narcissist. They know everything, except how to deal with COVID. Oh, we'll let that go. But so there's a kind of envy there. Well, science treats everything as material. I'm talking about the hard physical sciences now. The social sciences try to treat things involving human beings who we used to think had free will uh, as material entities too. I mean, the extreme of this is behavioralism, which says we're just a physical beings that respond to exterior stimulants, and what we think of our thoughts are just chemical reactions going on in our cerebral cortex. If that's true, literature doesn't really exist. I mean, think about this for a minute. Is there such a thing as Shakespeare's play Hamlet? Is there?
Do I think so?
Yeah.
Yes.
Where is it?
Okay. Where is Hamlet? Hamlet, well, that's a real good question. It's everywhere right now. I mean, you can find editions in libraries all over the
Exactly. I've got
world.
the Riverside edition sitting here. I've got the Norton edition. I've got an online edition. I just broke something. Um, so it doesn't have a physical location. Hamlet is not ink on a page. But if cultural materialism is true, there's nothing else for it to be. So the reason why all these things end up doing the same thing is they are denying any kind of transcendence, any kind of reality that can't ultimately be reduced to physical reactions. Usually the people in the humanities, of course, make it historical trends and whatnot. Marxism is the obvious example of this. Uh, Sort of materialistic Hegelianism, in which you have thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and this goes on till magically you reach the classless society, and everybody's happy and gets along well just because. Uh, but what makes these things all alike is they deny any reality to the work. You can do the same thing with music. Where on earth is Beethoven's Fifth Symphony? Depends on whose version you're listening to. But it's not that they're all totally different, which would mean there isn't any Fifth Symphony at all. They're just a lot of people calling something that. Because you can hear a version of it that's bad. You can make mistakes. You see what I'm getting at? So there is a kind of ideal Fifth Symphony. There's an ideal Hamlet that exists in a transcendent realm that is outside this purely material world. If there isn't,
That's because they're classics. They've transcended the short term and gone
well, I mean,
up to
that's
the
even true
eternal.
of a short story in a magazine or something. It's not the words, it's not the ink on the page. Uh, I mean, if you want to go that far, think about the English language or any language for that matter. It's not in the Oxford English Dictionary. That's just a list of words and definitions. It's not in a grammar book. It changes, but it changes the same way you and I change. Are you the same individual you were when you were 10 years old? Well, yes and no. You retain the same identity, but you've changed a lot. Well, it's so there's a you that transcends any particular immediate physical incarnation of yourself.
One of the other sort of philosophical points you make is you're a great critic of nominalism. Do you want to talk about nominalism a little bit and what that means and why you think it's been so bad for the study of literature?
Well, in a sense, I was just talking about it in a way. Nominalism is the philosophical position originally associated with William of Ockham, who gets mentioned, of course, in that novel by the Italian semiologist whose name has gone right out of my head, The
Umberto
Name of the
Eco,
Rose. Huh?
yeah, Umberto Eco.
Yes, Umberto Eco, The
And
Name of the Rose.
reading your book, I think it was your Shakespeare book, for the first time, I tried reading it several times. I don't think I ever did. Uh, I didn't know the title, The Name of the Rose, was a reference to Romeo and Juliet until
Yes,
I
yes.
saw your book. I mean, then it was like, wow, that's obvious.
Yeah. Well, the
But it's
nominalists say that uh, there are no such things as ideas. There are no general ideas. The only things that exist are individual singular things. For example, is there such a thing as a tree? No, a nominalist would say. There's this orange tree sitting out here outside my window. That's a tree. That is a tree. Uh, there's a carrot tree around the corner. That's a tree. There's a longleaf pine out there. That's a tree. But we just call them trees as a convenience for our minds. They're not really the same thing at all. They're totally different individual things. And when we use an idea, a general idea, a generalization really is just something in our heads. It has no real existence in the world. That seems to me to be patently false. It's true that the idea of a tree doesn't have the same kind of existence as an individual tree. And the idea of humanity doesn't have the same kind of existence as you and I do. But nevertheless, we know we're the same kind of thing. We, we can say, oh, that's a human being. If you stop and think about it, people who are nominalists, who are utopian progressives and so on, who are, whether they know the term or not, in effect nominalists, they all are ferocious about human rights. How can you possibly have something called human rights unless the creatures in whom these rights adhere are an identifiable class, which has a reality beyond, outside our individual minds? So that's why I'm against nominalism. It
and do you
basically says,
think nominalism is at the root of deconstruction and the other trends in the university, postmodernism, etc.?
oh, I do indeed think so. I mean, and Richard Weaver said the same thing back the year I was born in 1947, and ideas have consequences. He was one of Eric Voegelin also makes a big point about the nominalists, who, in a sense, are a particular medieval scholastic version of Gnosticism in a way, which is Vogelin's major metaphor. I'm guessing you know about him because you Heritage Foundation and so on. You know Vogelin's
Yeah,
work.
but I know his name, but I'm not a
Okay,
scholar
well,
of Vogelin. So
he it is in fact that one of the intellectual underpinnings of it. It's the idea that it really gets, you notice if you read That War with the Words, you'll notice the new historicists, Stanley Fish and his people, and so on. They're constantly undercutting the existence of any kind of ideal or principle. And we see this at work now, where we keep changing the terms of everything. I mean, I think this has reached, and I may be stepping on some toes for people who will be watching this, but I feel it has to be said. I think it's reached at kind of what we might call its pons asinorum, the bridge of asses, its utter nadir with transgenderism, in which there's no such thing as men and women. They can be whatever you want. In a sense, nominalism leads inevitably with that.
Well, we also saw a similar situation with the COVID epidemic when the CDC uh, or maybe the NIH changed the definition of a vaccine just by fiat from
Yeah.
something that prevents the transmission of disease to something that doesn't prevent the transmission of disease. And it was like, wait a minute, how did that happen? And it's a strange situation we find, because language becomes further separated from reality the more they do this, and you end up talking nonsense.
Yes, I think that's true. One of the things that I believe gives the game away is what I regard as the fate of the most misinterpreted book in the history of Western literature, which is Thomas More's Utopia. If you ask someone what utopia means nowadays, what are they going to tell you?
No place.
Oh, well, all right, that's something. Not most people wouldn't. They'd say it means the perfect place. And people have, for centuries now, long after More's death, interpreted the book as being More's plan for the perfect society. More was an ironist. It's a satire. When you say, I'm going to give you an account of the perfect place, it's utopia, i.e., no place. What are you saying? There's no perfect place. Well, in a way, what we've got nowadays with the crazies on campuses who are insisting that if you don't agree with everything we say, we're going to glue our hands to great paintings, or something like that, and that'll teach you. Uh, they're utopians. They want to make a perfect society. Well, if you'll recall, in Utopia, King Utopus, the first thing he does is cut Utopia, the landmass, which was a peninsula. He dredges it out and isolates it from the mainland. And he makes, you think Trump's immigration laws are stern. He makes it very hard to get in and out. He forces everybody to undergo all of this training to do. Of course, the great modern version of that came when you and I were young, when Pol Pot effectively murdered a third of the population of Cambodia to get rid of people who weren't on with the program. If I just kill all these bad people, it'll be perfect. Didn't work. Oh, and we've seen the same thing, of course, in Cuba. Uh, Voltaire, in a lucid interval, said something to this is a kind of English simplification of it. It's in a French poem. And if I were as smart as I ought to be, I could quote it to you, but I can't. But it comes out, the effect of it is the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think that's what we're seeing here. Literature is, we've got to take literature and make it serve creating utopia. We've got to make it fulfill our ideal of social and political perfection. And we can do that here on Earth. I don't
Of course,
think
Voltaire, for all of his philosophical, anti-establishmentarianism, he was, in fact, a believer in reason and being reasonable. And of course, his famous Candide, the moral is, well, you should just tend your garden. In other words, there is, like you said, or he also said, if there were no God, it would be necessary for man to invent one. So even Voltaire is far more reasonable than what's going on right now. What we have now is actually something that is way beyond reason, and
well,
I think that's why they're anti-literature de facto.
No, of course you're absolutely right. You might read something that doesn't fit in with the program, and if you can't simply deconstruct it, uh, keep the structure standing while you completely change the interior around and make it the opposite of what it was, then it's got to be destroyed. If I have to choose between Voltaire and Rousseau, I'm taking Voltaire every time. Rousseau is the guy who invented the notion of the general will, which of course means democracy is the art of the people in the know, the party members, we'd call them now, explaining to the people that what they voted for isn't what they really want. You don't really know what you want. We'll tell you, and we'll call it democracy. Uh, that's we've seen a lot of that in the 20th and into the 21st century.
Sadly to say, the French Revolution uh, spawned probably most of it probably led to Pol Pot because they were educated in France.
Well, of course it did. It led immediately to Napoleon. The Russian Revolution led to Stalin. I mean, this is why I don't know who I'm more concerned about, the campus radicals who, or the reaction, the kind of crude populist reaction, which has suddenly decided that Nazism is cool. And I'm going to be Thor or something like that and wear antlers. I mean, that's pretty frightening.
Well, one of the tragedies of the rise of communism was it created Nazi. I mean, had there been no Russian Revolution, there would have been no. I mean, this is all counterfactual history, but unfortunately, one thing does lead to another. I
Oh,
mean,
I think that's undoubtedly true. The draconian peace that the winning side came up with after World War One almost made Hitler inevitable. I think. I mean, pretty much so. Certainly, I know I'm going to again step on some toes, and it's something you can't prove, but I think it's certainly plausible that the rise of Hitler and Nazism was helped out by the fact that Germany was sort of licking its wounds for 15 years before Hitler came to power.
well, the Versailles Treaty was his main grievance, and
Yeah.
I mean, you can't rewrite all of history, but you can learn from it, supposedly.
Well,
And one of the interesting things is, at a certain point, I took some courses at SAIS, the School for Advanced International Studies, the NITSE School of Johns Hopkins, because I thought, well, I might do something in international relations. And I was shocked. They basically taught economics. And they taught economics and, like, military strategy somewhat. And as far as I could tell, but in the old days, the diplomatic programs, you learned history, literature, philosophy, and religion of the countries that you were studying. And there may have been a little bit, but I was very interested. I had been in Uzbekistan as a Fulbright teaching, and I was very interested in the global war on terror, it was called in those days, which is interesting. We didn't even discuss about the Moor in Othello being Moorish, and even in your discussion in your book, you didn't talk too much about. You did talk about Rodrigo Lopez, but the Reconquista of Spain. In other words, this clash of civilizations was something that Shakespeare would have been very aware of, not just between Protestant and Catholic, but between Islam and Christendom, as you call it, and the clash of civilizations was not allowed to be approved of already. There was sort of a dogma that that there is no civilization, and America's not a civilization. We don't have a clash of civilizations, and this is crazy talk. The Samuel Huntington said. But you call your book very pointedly Shakespeare and the idea of Western civilization. So you have to have a civilization for that to be there. And we used to talk about American civilization and as a sort of a separate or a subcategory. And I had been teaching in Uzbekistan. I taught in Russia. They were very cognizant of Eastern civilization, Orthodox civilization, which is one of the fault lines that Huntington had. Within Christianity between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic. And how can people act in the world in a successful way if they're simply kept in ignorance of some of the major factors of history, philosophy, religion, literature, etc., that go into other people's thinking?
It is my belief that a lot of the problems we have in education now, especially higher education, are not, to use the current little cliche, this business of keeping students ignorant of this, that's not a bug, it's a feature. I mean, I don't think they really want people to know these things. If you stop and think about it, even if you don't like the dead white Europeans, uh, surely you'd want to know about them since the world we're living in was shaped by them. But no, they want to, that's back to utopia. You just blot it out. You don't want people to know these things. Uh, it is crazy to me to uh, confine what passes for a liberal education. I don't even think they use that word anymore. But when you're doing everything you study in literature is actually, they call it cultural studies now, and anything can serve as literature, from a music video to an advertisement. Um, they simply drench people's minds in what's all around them anyway. Just to get out of teaching the endless composition courses I taught when I was a new assistant professor, I volunteered to teach the science fiction course. And I got into that and realized these kids know more about this than I do. And so what I ended up doing was teaching them where it came from in the past, which is not what they'd signed on for at all. They just wanted to be reading, ray guns and starship stuff. And I was making them see how Lucian, for example, wrote science fiction in his true history and that sort of thing. And for that matter, Utopia is, in a sense, a piece of science fiction. There was plenty of it going around. So, um, but we should be teaching them things they don't know, and they'll understand what they do know better. They'll know where it came from. They'll know what the people who are writing now are responding to. But one of the reasons I think our so much really shallow literature and art is being produced is it has no roots. They're kind of making it up as they go along, and it's uh, Northrop Frye, who I for the most part don't approve of, said one, I think, really smart thing, at least as far as it in a word sums something up. He said, "Poems are made out of other poems. Literature creates other literature, it inspires it." Um, no one proves this better than Richard Armour, the guy who wrote 1066 and all that. Did you ever read his little tale about going to Macbeth? And at the intermission, a lady comes up to him and grabs him by the lapels, as it were, metaphorically, and says, "Who do you think did it?" And he says, "Well, what do you mean? Macbeth did it." "Oh, no, that can't be. That's too easy. I think it was the porter." And of course, the joke is she doesn't understand literary genres. You can't understand literature without knowing some literature. And that's why we start children off with really easy fairy tales and parables and whatnot when they're young, and work them up to where they're sophisticated enough to put things in a context. Uh, and when you don't teach that, and that I think spills over into other, especially humanistic disciplines. To understand the history of America, you've got to know something about the history of England. Why did the Americans come here? To understand the history of Spain, you've got to know about the history of Islam, which conquered it. And I mean, you have to be able to make the connections, and that I think is what we're losing. I was interested in your point about reading. One of the things that has happened is the expansion of higher education so far that it's turned into lower education. I saw this even when I started teaching in the 70s at North Carolina State. I would have these poor kids because they started just trying to get everybody to go to college. Remember that? Everybody needs to go to college. Um, I have this. I remember one young man in particular who was doing terribly in the freshman comp course, his second semester, and he was in my office and I was trying to help him. I got him to talk about himself and try to figure out, how can we? And he said, well, I came here, I was going to major in engineering. And I said, well, why did you want to major in engineering? Well, my uncle had a TV repair shop and I used to love to work in it and work on the insides of the TVs and put them back together and so on. But I got here to do electrical engineering and I just couldn't pass calculus. So, and of course, nobody repairs TVs anymore. But he could have gone somewhere. This kid liked to work with his hands, liked to put things together. He could have probably made a really good living doing that. He turned into a business major. No, business administration major then. By the time I retired, they were all doing marketing instead of business administration. And some of them did well in it, but a lot of them, there's nothing for them to do out there. I ran into a young fellow. I was the third reader on his master's thesis. And he really was by no means one of our better students. It took him forever to finish the thesis. And it was passable thesis, but not great. But, we passed him. I went along with it. I was the out of field reader. It's a thesis on Hemingway, I think. And the department head was the second reader. He was an American Lit guy. And the then graduate director, who was American Lit, was the director. And I was kind of asking questions about Hemingway that I knew that the student couldn't answer, and they were looking, embarrassed and whatnot. But it was okay. We passed it, and then we got to talking to him afterwards. And by this time we're mid '80s, and this was a new department head, and he had brought in all this computer stuff, and we were going to make ourselves a department for the 21st century, and we were going to make our English majors employable by the high tech stuff in the area. It was Raleigh, North Carolina is one of the points of the research triangle with Chapel Hill and Durham, Now, all these high-tech companies there. Well, this young fellow had been working. He was one of those big companies, Northern Telecom, might have been, that was one of them. And he was in charge of all their technical writers. He had a big, important job by this time. And he just wanted to finish his thesis just to, get it done. His little Hemingway thesis. He was never going to do anything else with it. He just wanted to do it, wanted to have the satisfaction. He got it done. I admired him for that. Our department head said, well, I guess all of the computer courses we had really helped you. And he said, oh, I didn't take any of those. I just took literature courses. That computer stuff, you can pick that up in 2 or 3 months on the job. I cannot tell you how many MA students I had coming back from people who'd done, they used to call it programming, now it's coding, who got laid off because their jobs became obsolete and they were coming back to try to get an MA to do something they really enjoyed more. It happened all the time. I think it's going to happen over and over again. We're told now AI is going to get rid of all the coding jobs anyway. I doubt that's true, but
I don't know.
It certainly isn't a guarantee
know.
employment. Yeah. That's So my point to students is, if you don't enjoy the life of the mind, if you don't want to read a lot and talk about art and history and literature and philosophy and learn mathematics because you're interested in it, don't come to college. Go to junior college, get one of those degrees that put you in a job, go to a vocational school. I'm glad to see they're setting them up now. And a lot of those kids are going to make a whole lot more money than people who major in majors.
Well, the IT industry was started with people without college. I know, because when I was teaching at Hopkins, I was in the business school, and we got a lot of people who came back because suddenly the company started requiring college degrees or a master's degree of their employee, and they were just fulfilling a requirement. I mean, they were already whatever. And so, the bureaucracy wants college degrees, but in real life, as they say, to achieve things, sometimes it's better not to have them. I mean, because you can actually deal with what's really going on and not be diverted. But that's not to say college degrees are bad for everybody.
No, of course not. I would not.
It's like everything else.
At all.
I'm agreeing with you, but in other words, everyone should have a college degree, you know, it's the law of supply and demand in economics. If everyone has a college degree, it's not going to be worth very much. You know, that's just a fact.
I
And
pointed that out in an essay I wrote when I was an 18-year-old freshman at Rollins College in 1965.
well, good for you.
I mean,
That's how you ended up
it
chairman
just
of
seemed
the
perfectly
English
obvious to
department.
me, even then. It was just, I'd read an article in Time magazine about, you know, we need to send everybody to college and so on. And I thought, this is crazy. It's not. When I started at North Carolina State, our English majors, after class, you would see them sitting on the benches out in the hall talking to each other about what went on in the class. Not all of them, but a fair number of them.
Yeah,
And they talked in class.
yeah.
And by the time I left, they got out of class and they opened their cell phone and walked off ignoring each other. The smart kids in the class, and I was always grateful that I had a lot more really good students than we deserved, but I couldn't get them to say a word in class.
Well, everyone's afraid.
No
You want to
class
be
was they
expelled for being a
they
sexist,
didn't well they
racist,
didn't want to be
homophobe.
marked out as smart, as somebody who was interested. That wasn't
Well,
cool. It
that could
was
be too.
they'd come talk to me in my office endlessly. The only
Well,
ones who
that's
came to
good.
my office hours after I handed out papers were the ones who'd made A's and B's on the papers. The ones who needed to come wouldn't show up. I enjoyed it very much, but
All
it
right,
wasn't
listen.
doing those kids any good.
My earphone just beeped that it's running out of juice. So I think we have to unfortunately wrap this up. It's been absolutely fascinating. Maybe we can do it again on some other issues as they come up. I think this has been very provocative, and I can see why you were such a successful professor. And
Oh,
I hope that our viewers enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and that they will get at war with the word is from your library. It's from 1999, or you can get it used on Amazon. And actually, a fairly new book is Shakespeare and the Idea of Western Civilization. It's funny because everything disappears because of the special effects I don't know how to use. And
well, you can see them behind you. It's,
Yeah, and both are very well worth reading and very interesting, and a good contribution to the debate over what's happening in our university today. So I'd like to just take the opportunity again to say thank you, and we hope that you'll come back soon. And I appreciate that you took the time to talk to us today. So
it's been a great pleasure. Thank you. Get me talking about literature. You can't get me to shut up. Thanks
okay.
again.